All right, guys. Today we're going to talk about the lead up to World War II. The two main topics we're going to discuss is appeasement, the concept of allowing aggressors to kind of get away with their aggression in order to avoid war, and we'll also talk about the early stages of the war. Many historians talk about this concept a great deal. Hold on just one second. It's debated greatly by historians as to what role does appeasement play on the lead to the war. In reflection, the years following World War I were significant in the fact that the ethos of the time period for international affairs is avoid war at all costs, avoid another Western front at all costs. And what that ended up manifesting itself in diplomatic affairs was that once fascism and Nazism and militarism, in the case of Japan, grew and became aggressive, was that the great powers of the world, the allies and the democracies, thought that they would kind of give into this aggression in order to avoid war. In their minds, nothing was worth another Western front. One of the first examples of this is going to actually occur in, as we saw earlier in Japan, when talking about the invasion of Manchuria, and then into China, the League of Nations basically doing nothing and letting Japan get away with that. The second so-called wave of appeasement happening in the lead up to the war, starting in 1939 in Europe, is going to be the actions taken by Italy and by Germany. They're going to be expansionistic actions. So one of the first great events as far as Italy is concerned is the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, or what we know as Ethiopia today, that had been kind of in their sphere of influence for a long time. Their colonies in Africa had been near Ethiopia, but if you remember, going back to the Berlin Conference, that Ethiopia had maintained its independence. Mussolini, however, to solidify his image as this great conqueror and emperor and ruler in his mind, trying to recreate this Roman Empire in the great nation, fascist nation of Italy, and to live up to that, he had to be expansionistic. And in his own writings, he talked about the need to be expansionistic and to maintain warfare. And so he unleashed Italy's military onto this small country of Abyssinia, and they were able to conquer it. This had violated international law. The League of Nations had met about it, but in the end, despite calls made by Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Abyssinia, to the League of Nations did absolutely nothing. And in doing so, they sent the message, or at least how some historians interpreted that they sent this message to aggressors leading up to war, that the League of Nations is not going to step in, the Allies are not going to step in and stop aggression, even though that had become kind of a big part of collective security in the foundation concept of the League of Nations, that in order to preserve peace, that everybody would fight to preserve peace. But that is not what happens. There are some sanctions put on Italy, but despite that, nothing really occurs. Many feel that this encouraged Hitler to only be more aggressive. So if we look at German expansion, Hitler's idea of writing the Treaty of Versailles would be to get rid of essentially everything that Germany had a problem with, whether it's losing the territory, the downsizing of the military, the forbidden union with Austria. All of these things are events that and requirements of the Treaty of Versailles that Hitler wants to undo. So when we look at German expansion, one of the first things that Hitler does to test the Treaty of Versailles is refuses to pay reparations, as we talked about earlier in the last class. In response to his refusal to pay those reparations, the Allies essentially do nothing, when the Treaty of Versailles basically said that they would take action. But keep in mind that taking action in the breaking of the Treaty of Versailles truly only meant restarting the Western Front, and everybody wants to avoid that. When Hitler starts building up the military, he's breaking the Treaty of Versailles, and yet nobody in Europe felt it was worth going to war over. So what Hitler's eventually going to do is he's going to try to deal with the territorial constraints of the Treaty of Versailles that he felt were wrong. One of those is going to be the Anschluss, or the union with Austria. Hitler basically is going to roll across the border and into Austria and take that territory. It's strictly forbidden. It wasn't really violent. Most Austrians welcomed the German expansion. Many did not, but it wasn't resisted, and he took that territory. His occupation of the Rhineland, which was the Treaty of Versailles said was going to be demilitarized occurred in the 30s, and the Allies do nothing about it. And so this really shows kind of the weakness of both the League of Nations and the Alliance in kind of stopping these sorts of things. One last issue before we get to the big one of Munich and the Sudetenland, of appeasement is Hitler's interference in the Spanish Civil War. In the 30s, there's a war in Spain between liberal Republicans, people that wanted a Republican form of government, and fascists. And Hitler interferes in this war in the supporting of the fascist party, and in fact uses his air force in the years leading up to World War II to bomb cities for the fascists. So he ends up interfering in a violent militaristic manner, and yet the Allies do nothing about that. The big example of appeasement, as you read in your book, is going to occur in over Czechoslovakia. So if you look at the map here, remember that the Treaty of Versailles had stripped territory away from Germany, and it created new nations out of that territory. In doing so, it took some German-speaking German nationals and placed them in a new country. So, for instance, the new country of Poland, created by the Treaty of Versailles. In Western Poland, there were Germans. The new country of Czechoslovakia had German-speaking territory. So you can see on the map here for Czechoslovakia, in the case of Czechoslovakia and appeasement, you see the yellow areas are what we know as the Sudetenland. In the Sudetenland, there are Sudeten Germans, German-speaking people that wanted reunification with Germany. But this would be involved taking territory and annexing territory away from Czechoslovakia, completely forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler, encouraged by the Rhineland, encouraged by Austria, and the Allies do nothing about his expansion, and encouraged by what had happened in Ethiopia with the Italians, felt that he could push aggressively for taking the territory of the Sudetenland, and the Allies would do nothing. In this case, as he starts to move on to the Sudeten, the Allies do decide to try to take some action, but they're still very much trying to avoid any kind of militaristic or military interference. They do not want conflict. They don't want a renewal of World War I. And so the Munich conference was actually called with Hitler. The Allies said, hey, we need to sit down and talk about this issue with Czechoslovakia. So in September 29th of 1930, they meet at Munich. And the British Prime Minister that is there representing essentially the Allied powers is Neville Chamberlain. And this, to many people, became the number one episode of appeasement. And many historians have argued this is the point in which Hitler truly believes that he can expand without interference. At Munich, Hitler sits down at the table with Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, and basically assures him that all he really has wanted to do is to right the wrongs of the Treaty of Versailles. And by this point in the 1930s, having seen everything that happened to Germany through the 20s and 30s, many had kind of felt that the Treaty of Versailles was too harsh. Many sympathized with the idea that the Germans wanted to right the wrongs of the Treaty of Versailles. And so they felt that giving up the Sudetenland, which quite frankly was full of many people who wanted to join with Germany anyway, was a small price to pay to preserve peace. And Hitler convinced the Allies that he would stop. His aggression, his expansion would stop after he righted these wrongs of the Treaty of Versailles. So what happens at Munich is an agreement is put, the so-called Munich Pact, in which in exchange for Hitler's promise not to take any more territory, that the Allies would do nothing and sit by and let him take the Sudetenland. Chamberlain goes home, and he's cheered at the time. He claims that he's reached peace in his time, that he's avoided war. And quickly following that, Hitler moves and annexes the rest of Czechoslovakia, to the surprise and the shock of the Allies. And so when looking at this concept of appeasement, we're going to look at a couple cartoons today, the cartoon analysis, and this is one of them. And one of the arguments made about appeasement is that the more you appease, the more aggressive the aggressor becomes. And that's one of the lessons that people have tried to take from the lead up to World War II. Does this mean that people shouldn't be diplomatic at all times? And the answer to that question, I think, is clearly no. But what a lot of people look at what happened with Hitler was the unwillingness of the Allies to back up their agreements with Germany, to back up international agreement, to back up international law with the threat of force. It only made somebody like Hitler stronger and more aggressive. In any case, the Allies have put themselves in a situation now where no one's really sure how much more Hitler's going to move. After taking Czechoslovakia, he broke the pact. Following that, in August of 1939, an event happens that really kind of shocks the Allies, and by the time they have time to process it, it's too late. The surprising event is the formation of the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. And essentially what this was Germany and Hitler entered into an agreement, not an alliance, but an agreement not to attack each other, that they would be non-aggressive to each other, they wouldn't attack each other. And the surprise of this was, of course, was the fascist party hates communists, and so why would, and of course the Nazi party hates communists, so why would they ever make a deal with a communist regime in the Soviet Union? And the thoughts were that something was going on. There was going to be some kind of territory grab, there was going to be some kind of expansion, but no one was really sure what was going to happen. And as soon as that's signed, within approximately a week, we're going to see war break out in Germany. I'm sorry, I crossed a couple slides here. Let's go back here. All right, so we're going to see war break out. And this is the September 1st, 1939 invasion of Poland. In Europe, this is considered the beginning of World War II. But you have to keep in mind that the war had been going on for some time in China, in Manchuria, in East Asia, with a Japanese expansion. But what Hitler decided to do was he was going to take the territories of Poland, the territory that used to be part of the German Empire, and annex it and reoccupy it, and he was going to take it with force. He thought that given the experience of how the Allies reacted, that he could move his military to Poland and take it, and the Allies would do nothing. And so he unleashes war onto Poland, which he hadn't done in the other territories he took. The Rhineland, he was just supposed to be demilitarized, so he just occupied it. In the Anschluss, the taking of Austria, they literally just take down the borders and the Germans come across. But Poland was going to resist, and so he invades it with a new modern army recently built up, a new Luftwaffe, or the German Air Force, and he unleashes a thing called Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. And the point of lightning war was to avoid another war like World War I, where you have stagnant lines where there's large casualties. So in lightning war, the Air Force comes in, bombs targets, followed quickly by heavy armor. Behind the heavy armor is fast-moving infantry, then slow-moving infantry. And while they occupy, planes and tanks are moving on to the next. And so Poland falls relatively quickly. But what scares the rest of the Allies with the Soviet Non-Aggression Pact is as Germany moves into Western Poland, the Soviet Union moves into Eastern Poland, and they divide Poland in half. So many start to be concerned that the Soviet invasion and gobbling up of territory, the German invasions, they were somehow in some sort of kind of cahoots to annex and divide, to partition Poland. And no one really knows what's going to happen, but here's the key. France had made an alliance with Poland. And France had said that in the event that they were attacked, they would go to war. France had a commitment to protect Poland, and for France it was the last straw. Always being weary of German aggression, France then declares war on Poland in September of '39. And following that, we're going to have Great Britain, and we're going to see Europe is at war. So the next section, we'll look at kind of how the remainder of the beginning of the war starts, and then we're going to go up to the fall of France.